Now that we've had a chance to create material and assign it, I want to talk about common material attributes. You don't have to live with the defaults when you create a material and assign it. You can change it to change the way the material appears in the render. So I brought back the banana scene, and banana is still assigned to that yellow blend. But I've also added a directional light with a depth map shadow and a primitive plane on the ground just so we can see what the render looks like. In fact, let's render right now. Here's the render. So let's adjust the material to affect how this banana is appearing. So I'm going to go back to the hypershade, Window, Rendering Editors, Hypershade. And there's that yellow blend. To adjust the attributes, I'm going to double-click fast on the icon to get up the attribute editor. So the first attribute we dealt with is color, and that still remains yellow. I'm going to go down the list though and talk about a few of the other attributes. The next attribute is transparency. This defaults to black, which means that the surface is opaque. But if you raise this slider, whatever surface is assigned to this material becomes either semi-transparent or fully transparent. For example, if I change the slider to about halfway and raise the banana so it's not intersecting the ground and create a render, you'll see I can see through the banana. It's semi-transparent. I'll go back to the blend. So that's a transparency value of roughly 0.5, in other words, mid-gray. If I go all the way up on the transparency and re-render, it's 100% transparent. Now I still see the specular hotspot, but the color itself is completely gone. Now this is what a specular hotspot is. This is what specularity is. It creates an artificial, intense reflection in a small or narrow area. We're going to talk more about that in a second. In any case, a full 100% transparency, where transparency is white, makes the color and the surface go away, and all you have left, if you have it, is a specular hotspot. So this is a good way to create glass or some other surface that's semi-transparent. Now for any opaque surface, you should just leave that at black, or the default, and then your surface remains opaque. Below transparency is ambient color. Ambient color is the color of the surface where it receives no light. So if I move around to the opposite side of this banana and re-render, you'll see that the side that receives no light from the directional light is black. And that black color is provided by the ambient color. Now realistically, if there is no light, there is no color, the surface should be dark. However, you can artificially raise the ambient color for a specialized effect. So for example, if I raise this up to a dark gray and re-render, the surface becomes almost as if it's self-illuminated. So what was pure black becomes gray, and the yellow shows through. So the dark area is no longer dark. So you can think about it as self-illumination, or almost as if the surface has a little glow or has a light on the inside of it. So it's not realistic for lighting in this scenario because there is no light behind there, but it's a stylistic thing you can apply. Now often if you do use ambient color, you leave it at a really low value. For instance, I can even pick a different color, like say green, click off the color chooser, and then pull the slider down to make it a very dark green. By making it a very dark green, I'm inserting a little bit of green into the dark area, but I'm not washing it out completely. So now if I re-render, green shows through this dark area and creeps into the bright area, but it's not completely blown out. It's not overexposed. So it's a trick for inserting some color or some value into the part of the surface that receives no light. Now again, if you want to be more strictly realistic, you would just set this back to black. And as you expect, the part that receives no light would be black. But it's a good way to infer that the surface is self-illuminated, or even that the surface is receiving a small amount of fill light from some other source that we don't see. Again, the fill light, in terms of the three-point lighting setup, is that weaker light that fills in the dark areas. So you can use that to create the sense that there's a fill someplace. In any case, most of the time you just leave that as black. Below ambient color is incandescence. Incandescence also can make the surface look washed out, but it's designed to make the surface look like a light source. Now it won't light the other objects in the scene, but it will look like it's actually light itself. So if I increase the incandescence, then that assigned surface will appear as if it is emitting light. In fact, if you raise the slider fairly high, like towards white, you'll see the surface becomes almost pure white. It's as if that was a light bulb and you're looking directly at it. So once again, it's kind of a stylized attribute, just like ambient color. Most of the time you just want that to be left to black. But if you were texturing something that was supposed to be a light source, you could increase this value. I can also tint this a different color. So you want to make this look like a green light, I can set that to green. And now it'll appear like it's a green light bulb. But for now, I'll return that back to black. Below incandescence is bump mapping. Bump mapping will create the illusion that a surface is bumpy or rough, but you have to bring in a bitmap or a procedural texture. Now we're going to talk about that in a separate video. Below bump mapping is diffuse. Diffuse determines the overall brightness or darkness of a surface. Let me re-render it right now. And I'll swing back to the lit side. So diffuse determines how well the surface reflects light back at the viewer. In other words, how bright or dark it is. So the higher the diffuse value, and I'll render a region here so you can see, the brighter the surface is. So higher diffuse made that part of the banana brighter. The lower the diffuse value, the darker the surface. So if I render another region, the banana gets darker. So low diffuse value, high diffuse value. Default's 0.8, which is good in many situations, but you can adjust the diffuse on the material, and that'll be reflected by any surface assigned to the material. It's a good way to adjust that brightness and darkness without having to go back and change the light intensities or move the lights. Below diffuse is translucence, translucence depth, and translucence focus. Translucence allows light to leak through a surface. In other words, if you had a light behind the surface, the light would penetrate the surface and come towards the camera. By default, there is no translucence, and translucence is 0. Therefore, light cannot penetrate a surface. If you were to raise translucence, then light could bounce through the surface. And I'm going to save that for a later video also. Below that is specular shading. Now, these top attributes in the common material attributes section are shared by many other materials. For example, Lambert, Fong, or Fong-Yi will have these same attributes. Once we get down to specular shading, then things start to change a little bit. Now, this is specular shading for a blend. Fong and Fong-Yi also have specular shading, but they have slightly different controls. But we'll start with blend. Again, specularity is what creates the hotspot. So if I re-render now, that's the white line right here, the specular hotspot. That's emulating a really intense reflection of an intense light source. It's not a real light source, it's just an artificial one to give you that look. And specularity gives you the sense that a surface is either shiny or glossy or wet. Or if there is no specularity, that the surface is diffuse, as in diffuse like a piece of paper or a piece of cardboard where it looks very flat. And when I say flat, I mean the fact that it doesn't create any kind of hotspot. So in terms of adjusting specularity, you have eccentricity, specular roll-off, and specular color. Specular color is the color of the highlight, so you can tint that some other color, like green. So now if I re-render a region, I get a green hotspot. Or I can just return it to white. There's a white hotspot. Also, the brightness or the intensity of that color affects the intensity of the hotspot. So a bright white creates a more intense highlight than a darker gray. There's a gray highlight. In fact, if it's too dark, it fades away. Now, there's another attribute which affects the intensity also, and that's specular roll-off. Specular roll-off purely affects the intensity beyond the color that you choose for specular color. So now that I've picked a specular color I like, if I want to reduce or increase the intensity of that highlight, I can adjust specular roll-off. So a higher specular roll-off will increase the intensity further, so there I get an even bigger, more intense highlight. A lower specular roll-off will reduce the intensity, so the point starts to fade away. Now it's still there just barely in this area, but it's much more subtle. So there is a specular roll-off of roughly 0.2. Specular roll-off controls overall intensity of the highlight. The other thing to adjust is the eccentricity. Eccentricity affects the overall size. Now you'll see that color and roll-off do affect the size in terms of the specular highlight might grow along the edges. The eccentricity determines overall size through one slider. So if I increase the specular roll-off and specular color to make a brighter highlight, then I adjust the eccentricity, I can change the size. So if I lower the eccentricity, I get a smaller highlight in a smaller area. If I increase the eccentricity, I get a really large highlight, so much so it covers the entire face. So eccentricity controls the size of the highlight. So between those three, you control the specular highlight and control how intense or how subtle, how big or how small it is. Now below that, you have reflectivity. Reflectivity is the strength of actual reflections. Now we're not creating reflections right now because we're not ray tracing, but when we get to ray tracing, we'll return to this. Below reflectivity is reflected color. Reflected color is an artificial reflection. Now we're going to return to that also when we talk about reflectivity. It's a great way to make a fake reflection without having to ray trace, but since those two things are related, I'll return to those. So those are the main options. Now I mentioned that the specular options or specular attributes will change based on the material. So let's say I go back up here to the top, I change my type to another material type. I can switch right over to a Lambert. When I switch to Lambert, I still maintain my top common attributes, but in fact my specular attributes disappear. That's because Lambert does not support specularity, and therefore Lambert is great for any material that does not have a specular hotspot. So for instance, if you are doing a piece of paper, cardboard, or something very dull, then you might want to use a Lambert because there's no specularity at all. In fact, when I render now, you'll see that hotspot goes away. In fact, the banana looks very flat or very rough or very paper-like right now. So let's try a different type. If I go back up to type and change that to Fong, Fong has again the common attributes, but has a little bit different way of controlling specularity. It has a specular shading section, and what it has is cosine power. It still has specular color for the color, but cosine power determines the size of the highlight. So if I raise the cosine power, I get a smaller highlight. If I lower the cosine power, I get a larger highlight. So for Fong, cosine power determines the size of the highlight. And of course, you can change the color and general intensity with the specular color. Now if I go back and change the type one more time, I can change it to Fong E. Fong E. Fong E also has a highlight, but it has a separate set of controls. It has a highlight size for the size of the highlight. You can see that just in the icon right here. So small value, small highlight, large value, large highlight. Also has whiteness, which is the color of the core of the highlight. So I'll change that to say red. And also you have a separate specular color. So you have two different colors that can compose the specular highlight. And let me reduce the highlight size so we can see that better. So what you have is a combination of red and green combined together to create the highlight. So you're able to mix those two colors together. So those are the main materials you will be dealing with. There's Blinn, Lambert, Fong, and Fong Yi. There's some other esoteric ones here. The only other one that might be somewhat standard is anisotropic. That's at the very top of this list, anisotropic. Anisotropic also has a highlight, but the highlight has different shapes. In other words, it's not necessarily circular. And it also has potentially a different angle based on your settings. In fact, the first attribute in specular shading is angle. So as I change the angle, you see that a regular highlight up on the icon changes its orientation. You can also change the thinness and thickness by adjusting the spread X and spread Y. So spread Y will make it longer in that particular direction. So anisotropic gives you the opportunity to create a non-circular, non-coherent highlight. In other words, you can make a long, skinny highlight running in more than one direction. So those are the most important material attributes. And as long as you adjust some of the common ones like color, like diffuse, and your various specular attributes, then you'll go a long way in fine-tuning your material.